Welcome everyone to day 3 of the SAIS CARI annual conference, presented this year as a series of webinars over a period of 8 days. My name is Yoon Park and I am the Associate Director here at CARI. As some of you may know, and as I mentioned yesterday, the annual CARI conference has become, since the first in 2014, one of the premier places to bring together new cutting-edge empirical research on China-Africa relations with Washington, D.C.'s think tank and policymaking community. One of the few advantages of moving our in-person conferences onto a virtual webinar platform is that we've been able to expand our audiences well beyond the D.C. area. And for those of you logging in from different time zones across the globe, a very warm welcome indeed. First, a few notes about this Zoom event. Marie Foster, our invaluable program coordinator, without whom nothing at CARI would actually function, will be including links to speaker bios and additional information in the chat as you go. However, the chat function will not be available to our audience. If you have questions, you can type these into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screens. When you are typing in your questions, please be clear to whom you are addressing your questions and comments. Marie and I will be sorting through these and passing them on to our speakers at the end of this event, as we conclude in the last 25 minutes or so. Please note that while we will do our best to get through all of them, it is likely that we will not be able to answer all of them during the live event. Recordings of today's event, as with each day's sessions, will be made available, typically about 3 to 5 working days after each event. These links will be up on our website as soon as we receive them from our IT team. And now on to today's event. For those of you who tuned in to the first 2 days of the CARI conference, you will note that today is organized slightly differently. If we were all physically together in one of the SAIS conference rooms, we would be listening to our keynote lecture over a light lunch. Unfortunately, we can't feed you today. However, because we have our audience for an hour and a half, we were able to invite, in addition to our keynote speaker, 2 discussants. So you'll get to hear from 3 experts in the field. In terms of today's events, I will first introduce our keynote speaker and allow him his 30 minutes to make his presentation. You will then see me again briefly as I introduce our 2 discussants. They will each make their remarks and they'll each have about 10 minutes to do that. And finally, you'll see all of us on the screen again for the Q&A. With that, please allow me to present our keynote speaker, Professor Chris ALDEN. Professor ALDEN is Professor in International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, or better known as LSE. And director of LSE Ideas. He is author or co-editor of a number of critical tomes in China-Africa relations. These include New Directions in Africa-China Studies, China and Africa, Building Peace and Security Cooperation on the Continent, China and Mozambique, From Comrades to Capitalists, Return to Africa, and of course, China in Africa, which was published in 2007 and one of the first books to explain the contemporary China and Africa relationship. He regularly teaches courses at University of Cape Town and Peking University and was senior lecturer in the International Relations Department at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, where I first met him. On a personal note, I would like to add that Chris has been a mentor, a role model, and has become a dear friend over the years. When I was still living in Johannesburg and finishing up my PhD at WITS, there were then very few people working on China-Africa relations. Among them, Chris, together with Ian Taylor, Jamie Monson, and our own Deborah Bradegum, were our interpret leaders. Chris took me under his wing in numerous ways. He provided an opportunity to co-edit a special issue on China-Africa of Le Temps Moderne. He commissioned me to write a piece on Chinese migration in Africa for SAIIA, and he provided guidance, always respectfully, kindly, and gently, when I was still a junior academic, years and years ago. Moreover, I know he's done the same with countless other China-Africa scholars over the years. And this is this kind of support within the field, which he continues to give even while juggling his regular teaching responsibilities, traveling back and forth between the UK and South Africa and the Washington, DC area, and producing a steady stream of quality research, which earned him much deserved respect within the China-Africa research community. It is my great pleasure to present my friend, my colleague, and my mentor, Chris ALDEN.
Thank you very much. Very, very generous of you to say so many positive things there, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Deborah, as well for the invitation, and colleagues. Good to see colleagues virtually. I prefer paper shuffling this, the beginning of any such conference, but I guess that world is long gone. So I'll jump right into our talk today. I'm going to share a screen here of my PowerPoints. Let me do that. And let's get this up to where it's supposed to be. And let me get it to the correct, sorry. Get it in the right format. Okay, super. So I'm talking about an issue today that certainly hit the agenda. It wasn't initially a feature of China-Africa relations in years past, but it's certainly climbed up the agenda in recent years. China's changing role in African security. I probably have a longer PowerPoint with more material than I can speak to in the 30 minutes. So I'm going to jump around a little bit just to make sure that the bits that I find that I want to communicate are communicated clearly and effectively. Let me say that I'll start today by mentioning something about China's changing role in the international security environment. More generally, we have to contextualize this. Africa does have a special place within that, but there is a larger debate. And then drill down a bit into African security and China's approach over the years, an evolutionary approach as it sought to devise an appropriate strategy, an appropriate response to security issues, concerns, and questions. I'd like to map out a bit of China-Africa's new security ambitions. And here I'm going to draw principally from the FOCAC 2018 checklist. Discuss a little bit about trends, just unpack a few ideas that come from that, reflect, having drilled down into Africa, step back a little bit and discuss a few other issues and conclude. So that's the trajectory here. As I said, it's a big agenda, so I'll try to hit the highlights. And I know that the point of this conference more generally has been one which has allowed people to really provide some of that rich empirical details. In this short presentation, I'll touch on themes, less on the empirics as such. As I said, China's role in Africa and African security must be contextualized. It's part of an expectation of China being more involved in international affairs, a byproduct of its engagement in economic terms, certainly accelerated by the joining to the WTO in 2001. And in fact, that was a sort of model, you might say. There was an expectation that the China which complied with international regulatory regimes, expanded market access as part of its effort to join in with the liberal international economic system, would also be willing to endure similar disruption, transformative domestic and ideas change to conform to the security provisions of what was expected of, as the term was at the day, a responsible stakeholder. The result of that we see is a gradualism, and that's which is characteristic of China's approach to international security, and indeed to other aspects of its engagement internationally. At the core remains the question that of the sovereignty principle. The degree to which any of these actions would compromise, alter, change China's position on sovereignty, non-interference, and questions of non-intervention. Indeed, non-intervention, non-interference were quickly, not quickly, but gradually separated, and there became a role, a recognized role for intervention within the context of multilateralism, endorsed by regional organizations, as if possible, invited by host governments, which legitimized for China collective intervention in security matters. And we see tentative steps in peacekeeping after '98 and combat-ready peacekeeping troops from China after 2012. And all of this took place, or most of this took place, the bulk of it took place within Africa. And as one Chinese foreign policy experts characterized Africa as a sort of zone of experimentation. So what are the characteristics of the changing role of China in African security? First is gradualism. It's been incremental at every step. Secondly, pragmatism alongside principles. So the two are working together. There would be the principle of non-interference upheld throughout as a sort of operational flag flown, but pragmatism in the sense of dealing with practical issues and not letting principle steer too far away from problem solving. And in the context of this, the inevitable engagement in domestic affairs with Africa. That development and security are linked, that these are things that you can't undo, that they're separate, or to do so is to do so at one's peril, in the sense that the aims of development may produce security concerns. Security concerns are not solvable without a development agenda that's strongly fitted. So the oddity that may come from some observers of seeing, for instance, a military engagement, the base in Djibouti, linked with infrastructure, large infrastructure loans, development projects, and what have you, is actually, that comes naturally, that synergism between the two in the Chinese perspective. Multilateral security might have been the starting point for China's engagement in African security matters, but there were private initiatives increasingly generated by the Chinese communities or businesses which sought security protection of their interests, etc. Commercial drivers are bandwagoning in this as well, that Chinese SOEs have become leading providers of defense products, arms sales. Private security companies have also become more prevalent, certainly prevalent and more prevalent since 2010 and afterwards. And then finally, the newest focus that I'm going to talk a little bit about is on legal framework, that this complements role in policing and intelligence cooperation. So there's really a very broad, it's gone from a very narrow focus to quite a broad gamut. What have been the drivers of such action? Reputational, global and African expectations of China as a Security Council member, as the only developing country on the Security Council. Firm level security concerns, that is to say, as Chinese firms expanded their presence across the African landscape, including conflict zones, Sudan being the most obvious of them, but there were others as well, that they found themselves to be caught up in the crossfire, and or in some cases targeted, and they needed to get security. Individual level, the communities that have the migrants or people working in these Chinese managers and workers in these various firms have themselves felt targeted at times by crime, sometimes systematically, sometimes incidentally, and that has also been a matter of concern. But perhaps all of these factors, which were present really from the late 1990s, when all of this this gradualist engagement, economic engagement began, really came together in sharp form with the Libya crisis of 2011, where Chinese firms, 50 odd big projects, plenty of Chinese SOEs and private firms, something on the order of 35,000 Chinese individuals working there, all under short order found themselves caught up in the middle of a NATO bombing campaign and a civil war. And between the two of those, they had to get out fast. And it became clear to China and the Chinese government and the Chinese public that this needed to be done and done well. And so being outside of the security environment was no longer possible. China had to take those initial steps that it had been involved in and really formalize them, become more active and actively engaged. So there were three planes of action that China did so, produced or developed rather, not produced, but developed. One of them, it developed further its multilateralist strand of engagement in security matters. Secondly, the bilateral, which was varying strengths, was to be encouraged. And then at the subnational, be it at company level, firm level, or on the part of communities, they also sought to engage in security matters and escalate and improve their situation. Chinese activism came down to, and I'm just going to touch on a few of the highlights. We have anti-piracy campaign, which began back in 2009 in the Gulf of Aden, also in the Gulf of Guinea. Here it was China joined up in this process. It had strong commercial reasons to do so. It has a navy which at the time, pre-Djibouti, had no basing rights in the region, so this became one of the big push factors for taking up a position in Djibouti. After 2011 and Libya and concern about other equivalent risks around the continent and elsewhere, the FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, produced a partnership, called for and created a pillar specific to peace and security. And subsequent FOCACs have promoted and elaborated on the security measures, China-Africa Defense Ministers Forum. I just put the Djibouti base because that's one of the sort of signature events here. Again, I've already mentioned it, but this quote I think is interesting because it tells us a lot about the Chinese approach to security and the African response to security initiatives. We don't, the foreign minister at the time said, we don't want the Americans to leave, but the Chinese invest billions of dollars in our infrastructure. That's what the Americans are not doing. So we're trying to keep the balance, to see where our interests lie as a small country with very limited resources. So, you can see that there's that this development security nexus fits well with the interests of governments, African governments. They're bilateral military-to-military agreements, training programs, arms sales. These all grew over time. As I suggested, private security firms, both of Chinese origin or African or elsewhere, also were employed by state-owned enterprises and others to protect the goods. Just a word, a bit about the commercial defense industry and its role in Africa. Of course, just like all the other state-owned enterprises, there was consolidation in the late 90s of what was a disparate scattered sort of defense, proto-defense industry in the country. It's the top, with relatively quickly, in a fairly short order, it became China's defense SOEs became amongst the top ones, 3 in particular. As the products have developed, they've moved up the value chain, you know, they've also sought out markets for goods, and those products, if I can put it that way, have looked to Africa, certainly at the lower end, the light weaponry and some larger weaponry as well. And the first instance, the so-called pariah regimes, the Sudan, the Khartoum, and the like, these were the governments that were anxious to make purchases. And in some sense, the Chinese platforms, which have a basis in Soviet or Russian era defense armaments, could use price competitiveness to break into those markets. Again, not to go into too much detail here, arms sales from China have indeed increased to the continent. But they don't represent an enormous amount of the entire percentage. Others have spoken about this or will speak on this in the conference. It's more or less it's not static at about 7 to 8% of the total arms sales in the continent. If you were to actually disaggregate and look at sub-Saharan Africa and small weapons, this is where China excels and if not dominating, certainly plays an important role. So I wanted to talk about another aspect of the security ambitions, which I think doesn't often get spoken about, and I think it's important to flag this one. If you look at the FOCAC 2018 action plan, I think it's a very good representation of the ambitions that China and Africa collectively have for security on the continent. And amongst the things they talk about is 50 security assistance programs in law and order, peacekeeping, cybersecurity, anti-piracy, and counterterrorism. So the agenda is clear. 50, almost the whole of the continent that formally recognizes Beijing, it would be represented by that, though it's not clear that is meant to be one security assistance program for each country. There's been apparently no spend yet on the $100 million that had been announced in 2015 towards a rapid reaction force and supporting that and the standby force. There's a China-African Security Fund, which is a commitment to continue to support anti-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden and Guinea, and peacekeeping missions in the Sahel. There's a call for intelligence sharing with Afripol on terrorism and cross-border crimes, training programs for anti-corruption amongst 100 African officials, and then a forum of defense ministers to develop a kind of regularized annual discussion, confidence building, get to know one another. So those are the general headline items. I think there's some, but I'm going to pick out a few of the paragraphs that I think are often missed in this. This is one of the paragraphs, 6.2.1. Two sides will set up anti-corruption cooperation, make use of the UN Convention Against Corruption, for cooperation on case-by-case basis of fugitive repatriation and asset recovery, and be more flexible in cooperation within the extent of domestic laws. So we're looking at fugitives on both sides. The suggestion I might have is the fugitives are more likely to be Chinese into Africa, asset recovery associated with that as well. We see, so that's criminal activity we're talking about, designated. Anti-corruption exchanges, 6.2.2, cooperation on improved cooperation mechanism for extradition, legal assistance, asset recovery. So again, the same thing, accelerate the signing of extradition treaties and mutual legal assistance in criminal matters and other agreements. So again, the emphasis on extradition, getting those things bedded down into law, asset recovery, so losses that might or financial or physical assets and bringing those back to the state. 6.2.5, a forum design on law enforcement security to be established, and the emphasis will be here on police exchanges. So it's about domestic policing here, emphasizing that. Another 6.2.7 focuses on declares that there will be setting up of shared intelligence, technologies, and experience, joint exercise and trainings to improve African law enforcers' ability to safeguard the security of major domestic economic projects. So again, it's about training up, presumably provide sharing, transfer of knowledge, what have you, in the area of policing, domestic policing, the like, to enhance the ability to protect domestic projects. And then it says in very specific terms, protect the safety of Chinese nationals, Chinese companies, and sorry, I can't see, I can't see on my screen because it's blocked out. But I'm sure you can read it and tell me what the rest says. Chinese nationals and companies and interests, that's right. Okay. Thirdly, another part of that is 6.2.11. The two sides are to strengthen exchanges and cooperation in law-based governance, enhance mutual trust, etc. Work together, improve the existing international legal system in terms of the BRI cooperation. So there's a deficiency in the international legal system, and it will be righted, if you like, through working together, China and Africa and African states. And finally, I think that's finally, yes. The two sides will improve FOCAC Legal Forum, the Conference on Legal Risks, Countermeasures, International Investment and Trade, conduct exchanges and training of legal personnel, joint arbitration centers, subunits of centers of research and legal professional training bases established in universities, exchanges developed, again, all around the idea of a legal system of those that's particular to the BRI countries. So I think this is a really interesting and ambitious agenda. And it's interesting to me that this is all sitting in security cooperation. So just to summarize, security capacity building, police training, intelligence cooperation, lawyers also being exchanged and training. Extension of commercial law, so arbitration, reducing obstacles to trade, some of the legal obstacles, smoothing the regulatory regimes, insofar as these things have been blocking investment or impacting on investment. These are to be negotiated and where possible reduced in such a way as to make a smoother process. And then security laws, very specifically, extradition, anti-corruption, and terrorism, or anti-terrorism. So there's some very specific things here. There's China's concerned with the legal basis for the extradition of nationals charged with corruption or other crimes. You can read that into this. China's concerned with terrorism, especially given the history of Africa as a refuge for jihadists of various kinds. Its own domestic problems in this area in Central Asia. So there's a concern that Africa may have that. African government may host that. African governments share similar concerns specific to the particular security issues on jihadism, on criminality and the like. So this is a two-way exchange in this area. I also think there's another aspect, something that a phrase they call lawfare, which is defined as, one definition is a method of warfare where law is used as means of realizing a military objective. And here, this is in a security setting. Remember, all of these things about legal means are embedded within a section of the FOCAC, giving expression to ambitions in legal terms, which have security implications. It's very much a part of, if you dig a bit, you'll see that lawfare has, that China's played a role and recognized the role of lawfare for many years in its own military strategy as part of the so-called three weapons: media warfare, psychological warfare, and lawfare, and used by the military to complement kinetic action, okay, activism. So it's both an instrument and a context, for militaries. Obviously, China's not the only country that does this. The United States employs lawfare, to choose but one country, as an instrument in combination with, for instance, financial capabilities to enforce criminal prosecutions in other countries, extraditions, enforce sanctions to get compellence on the part of other countries to abide by sanctions, target individuals, close banking accounts, make procurement processes dependent upon compliance. So all of these sort of things are examples of the variety of uses of lawfare. So it's interesting that this is being brought in, or at least the foundational aspects of it in this section on security, arguably could be laid there. We shall see, of course. So to unpack the trends and bring it to a conclusion, gradualism and symbolism is, I think, one of the key features of China's role in African security matters. We've seen since 2012, frontline combat troops, but overall engagement has been relatively restricted still, certainly more than any other Security Council member, but not in as compared to, say, African governments, or some of the other governments which have been more present in terms of the combat side of these things. There are certainly considerable experience and military commanders in the peacekeeping operations, which have been led by Chinese commanders. The conduct of Chinese peacekeepers has been praised for professionalism and work ethic, criticized as being risk averse. So there's a debate around that. There's still no major deployment of Chinese frontline combat troops in any theater on the scale of those African or some of the Western military. So that's why I say it's still gradualist. I think it has symbolic value in that respect. Financial value is, of course, more recognized and significant. And that brings me to the next feature, development and security nexus. As said before, this plays well with China's strengths, and it fits with its preferences for engagement in the security sector. The sovereignty principle holds up well in this setting. Finance and infrastructure provisions and the building of the local economy accord well with both Chinese capabilities and its economic interests. There is a bit of a debate on norms of state building in the liberal mold in the classic UN liberal peace model, though that itself is being reshaped has been reshaped over the last few years anyway, in a generally in the literature and in policy. And then we see operational deployment, some critique of deployment being aligned with economic interests. So China deploys in places where it has economic interests. South Sudan is perhaps the most obvious of these. The oil sector, I think this is frankly an overreading. I think it's it's clear that any country that is going to get off its feet needs some sort of economic basis. If it happens to be the oil sector and it happens that there are Chinese interests there, that's a convergence of circumstance, not a convergence of interests, in my view. But it's surely a matter for debate. Finally, the expanding legal framework. As I've mentioned a moment ago, this idea of developing a framework to unblock the legal barriers to commerce, to expanding it, to persecute criminal conduct more effectively, and a larger question about whether there's a competitive dimension here, whether there's a lawfare dimension, which is already a recognized feature in the policies and approaches of the US and China in other areas, be it the Huawei, be it national security law towards Hong Kong or what have you. Finally, what are the obstacles to realizing FOCEC's 2018 ambitions? African state structures remain weak, limited governance capacities, constraints We can see those constraints even in those countries designated as comprehensive strategic partners. I'm thinking of South Africa in particular, all sorts of frustrations and difficulties in getting that kind of deeper embedded cooperative ministerial level stuff working. So the weaknesses are especially pronounced in national judiciaries, police services. So this is a tall order to get this to work. Those areas where there's been very close military to military cooperation have not always worked out well in terms of serving Chinese interests. I think the tug and pull of domestic politics in Zimbabwe is but one example of that. Quickly, out of Africa, I think that we need to we need to have given a bit of, we should look at this in a not comparative perspective, but just recognize that Africa is becoming less distinctive for China, right? As the BRI expands China's role, provides a vehicle for, an instrument for, and a strategic vision for China's involvement in all sorts of economies, infrastructure, what have you. Single projects exceed by a considerable amount all of the financing developed for Africa. Put down the Gwadar Port Road project, 87 billion versus 60 billion put forward in 2015 and 2018. And the security problems that are associated with these things really put the African situation, it's a matter of scale difference. Finally, beyond China, I think it's interesting is that African countries are also looking to other actors to provide security, other emerging actors, Turkey in particular. We can see this in Libya. Military, and what's interesting is how fast they've been able, they're not shy to get involved, intervention, and they've come in on advisors with equipment, etc., in short order, and they've also secured prime resource and infrastructure. How they've done it, I don't know. My last comments is to say, by way of summary, China remains cautious in its approach to African security. Africa is not nearly an interest-based, all the metrics of interest as important as some of the other regions. These features are, however, the distinguishing features are dealing with the large migrant community, Chinese, and the sectoral exposure in particular areas. There's opportunities for arms there. Multilateralism is a favored instrument for engaging, which is unusual as compared to some of the other regions of the world. And then the last, and commercial law and lawfare are becoming more consequential. My last point is to say that in fact, we really haven't seen China tested in any significant way, whether having, after Libya, thrown so many resources, relatively more resources and commitments, building a deeper network to manage security concerns across a range of areas, it has yet to face the kind of crisis situation that of a scale of Libya. And so we don't really know what that response will be, both in terms of the action itself and domestically. Okay, I think I should stop there. Thank you very much for listening to all of this.
Thank you, Chris, so much for a really detailed and insightful analysis of the shifting security relations between China and Africa. With that, I want to introduce our two discussants for today. If you hadn't already noticed, both Professor ALAO and Jung were co-editors with Professor ALDEN on the book China and Africa, Building Peace and Security Cooperation on the Continent. Dr. Abiodun ALAO is Professor of African Studies and the Program Director of the African Leadership Center, School of Global Affairs at King's College London. He has published extensively on African affairs, including emerging powers and global leadership, the politics of natural resource management, religious radicalization and political violence, and politics, security, and international relations in Africa. After Dr. ALAO, we'll hear from Dr. Chun. He is professor and director of the academic committee at the Center for African Studies at Yunnan University. He is also an adjunct senior researcher at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. His research focuses on Sino-Africa relations, African politics and security, international relations theory, and development studies. Each of our discussants will have about 10 minutes to make some comments on Dr. ALDEN's talk. So Dr. ALAO, we go to you first.
It's always a great pleasure to speak after Chris, because the good thing is that you are often left with very little again to say. You will have touched on everything that you have left with very little things to add to it. The only area where I think I can add one or two things is to look at how Africa sees China in the area of security. This, I think, it's the only area where I can add one or two things to what Professor ALDEN has said. I think from Africans' point of view, China had something like a takeoff advantage where security is concerned. Because right from the beginning, many Africans see China as a partner. And when you look at the role that the country played in the liberation struggles in Southern Africa, you can understand the reason for the admiration and the affection that many people in Africa had for China. But to some of them, that happens to be the old China. The new China now is slightly different. And I'm going to touch on few key areas where Africans are getting increasingly concerned about the role of China in the security affairs of the continent. Many Africans are quite happy with the role that China is playing in peacekeeping, because China seems to have a peculiar attitude towards peacekeeping, which is quite different from other peacekeepers that have come to the continent, because apart from the physical aspect of peacekeeping, China is often interested in other long-term security developments of the countries, and they have an approach of peacekeeping that is uniquely different and uniquely Chinese. It is not uncommon to see many Africans say, especially in a place like Liberia, where China did quite a lot in terms of peacekeeping, for them to say, don't worry, the Chinese are coming to fix it. That's an attitude that many people in Africa had towards China when it comes to the area of peacekeeping. Going beyond the traditional peacekeeping to offer assistance to the countries where they are involved in is something that many Africans are quite appreciative about. But there are other aspects of Chinese involvement in African security that many Africans find extremely disturbing. And I want to seize this opportunity to identify and discuss very briefly some of these. Many people in Africa believe that Chinese attitude to security in the continent is pro-government and not necessarily pro-people. They are always interested in sustaining the government in power without taking into consideration the attitude of that particular government to the well-being of the citizens. This is something that has many consequences and many ramifications, which people in Africa find disturbing. The whole claim that China has this attitude of non-interference in the internal affairs of many African countries. Some people believe very strongly that it's a case of strategic non-interference, that indeed China is interfering in different ways. In fact, sustaining a repressive government in power is nothing more than deep interference in the internal affairs of many of these countries. And people are always, Africans are always very quick to point to the direction of what China did in Zimbabwe or Sudan to identify and discuss aspects of Chinese involvement in African security that they find extremely depressing. Again, another thing that I want to identify is the role that China is playing in illegal mining activities and the security ramifications of this in Africa. I think it's beyond what can be denied that Chinese, I don't know the extent to which it has the endorsement of the government, but Chinese are deeply involved in illegal mining activities in many African countries. I can say this with a degree of authority because my state of origin in Nigeria is a victim of these illegal Chinese activities when it comes to involvement in mining. So this is something that is an aspect of African security that people in the continent find unacceptable when it comes to the activities of China. But what is also important is the extent to which Chinese have been involved in repressive activities in the continent, in the ways that they handle their domestic staff, in the ways that they handle their staff working in their companies, the brutal human rights violations in this. These are ramifications of security that are worth looking at. Instead of, we should not just look at security from the surface, but also look at the way security interferes with domestic policies. So this I think is something that is worth looking at. So broadly, what I'm trying to say is many Africans are appreciative of what China has done and what China is doing. But there are recent developments that they find completely unacceptable. And if these are not addressed, the long-term ramifications of these are quite dangerous, and it may affect the way that many people in Africa perceive China. I think I'll stop here now and I'll wait for questions that I may use to expand some of the things that I've talked on in this brief submission. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech. And also, I'd like to thank Deborah for inviting me to participate in this timely discussion. I think that Professor Chris has given us a very comprehensive view about the changing role of China in African security. So I want to just clarify some questions also mentioned by Professor Chris ALDEN. First of all, as Professor Chris ALDEN mentioned, the so-called lawfare, or why China strengthen legal and governance cooperation with Africa, especially after the 2018 the FOCAC Beijing summit. So to answer this question, we have to look back the contemporary China-Africa relations. If we think back to 1960s, 1970s, you can find that China-Africa security cooperation, or China's role in African security in that time, mainly to support Africans' national liberation or anti-colonialism So why China support the national liberation movement of African countries in that time? The key was that at that time, the historical mission of African people actually was to gain their political independence, to establish their sovereignty, their nation state. So that's why China's support mainly focused on national liberation supporting. Then for now, what are the main mission of for African countries, African people? In my personal view, I think that this is also a common, some common understanding of many researchers. That is to gain their economic and social development is the key for African people, for African countries. So that's why we now pay so much attention to Africans' development security lectures, pay so much attention to the legal cooperation, the governance experience exchanging, and so on. So I think that this is very important to keep in mind that what is the key historical mission for African people and African countries. And if we think from this perspective, it's much better much easier to understand the current China-Africans peace and security cooperation, or the changing role of China in Africa, African security. So now we see China-Africa peace and security cooperation. This peace and security is not only limited in the traditional one, but a much broader meaning for this security peace, because they mainly related to the social and economic development. This is the first point I want to address. The second one is that whether China now is becoming much more proactive in African security, the answer is yes and no. For yes, as Professor Chris ALDEN mentioned about, China has expanded its role in lots of affairs. For example, even within the UN peacekeeping operation, traditionally, or 10, 20 years ago, China mainly sent logistic supporting troops, but now China sends combating troops, helicopter units, and other much more, we see, combating troops, even still very limited. If you see other areas, the legal issue, the governance cooperation, policy exchange, many things. So I think that the answer is yes. China now is becoming much more active. But also, as Professor Chris ALDEN mentioned, China is still very restrictive in engaging into African security. I think that here is what didn't change in the past years or decades in terms of China's role in African security. What didn't change? The first one is we can see the non-interference principle or sovereignty principle. We didn't change. You can see yesterday or the day before yesterday, our speakers also mentioned about the arms sales of China to African countries. A key characteristics is that China's arms sale many limited in some non-lethal equipment. Even yes, we have some lethal arms, but many non-lethal equipments. So that means even such bilateral military-to-military exchange or arms sales and other engagement, China always keep cautious about the boundary of interference and non-interference, especially when China engaged into African security affairs, especially for example, UN peacekeeping operations, conflict mediation. I think that the two principles are very important for us to engage such activities. First is to choose collective platform or multilateral framework to engage. The second is to be invited, but not coercive engaged. Then I think that the ownership principle is also very important for China. I just mentioned in 1990s, 1970s, we mainly support Africans' national liberation movement. But now we mainly focus on the development related security affairs. So mainly for support the development of African countries. So that's why I say yes and no. China's engagement in Africa security is becoming more active, but still keep very limited. So that's why. And finally, I want to see something about the private security or subnational security. In this regard, because China is a newcomer, no matter in economic or security affairs in Africa continent. But as Professor ALAO mentioned just now, who is the Chinese when we talk about the Chinese or China? So there are many Chinese, there are many China, many faces of China. So when we talk about the sub-national level security engagement, many of them actually are not national actors. They are private actors, and their capacity in terms of security actually are very, very weak. So that's why you can find that in the past several years, China's various private security engagement in African countries actually caused lots of trouble for Chinese government, for African government, but that actually there are not Chinese official or government representatives. But anyway, that's a challenge for Chinese government, for Chinese people, how to manage, how to teach these sub-national level, sub-national actors to have better understanding of African security situation, the habits and norms and rules and many such things to how to say, to contribute more to the national level or even higher level peace and security cooperation, but not making more troubles. So I'd like to stop here. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you again to our keynote speaker, Chris ALDEN, and to our two discussants, Professor ALAO and Professor Jung. we have a handful of questions, so I'm going to start reading them off, and there aren't too many at the moment, but perhaps we can go in rounds of 3 or 4 and go back to the panel. If we can try to do squeeze in 2 rounds, we'll try to do that. So first, for Professor ALDEN, I have a question here from Maggie Zhang. She says, from your research, do you see any alignment or overlap in China's UN peacekeeping and its bilateral security actions in Africa, especially in applying UN rules regarding legal framework? In other words, is there any evidence linking with or interacting with UN SDGs for peace and development in Africa, especially with regard to democracy and governance? And then another question from Emma Schleffer. Thank you very much for an insightful talk. My question is, can and should the US move from viewing Africa primarily in terms of geopolitical competition? Is there anything the US can learn from China, positive or negative, in how to engage with the region? And perhaps I can take advantage of my role here and tack on a question to that. There have been several other colleagues who work on China-Africa who talked about potential areas of collaboration and cooperation on and security matters is one of those. Ambassador David Shen, who we will hear from later next week, amongst others, has talked about cooperation between the US and China in anti-piracy activities, for example. So maybe tacking on to Emma's question, are there potential opportunities for cooperation? So maybe if we can take that round first, I'll come back with some more questions.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to, before just comment on my to thank my 2 discussants and to just pick up on a theme that Professor Jung had mentioned, and as did Professor ALAO, which is the conduct of subnational actors. They're badly behaved individuals out there, doing things which bring disrepute, the reputation of China into disrepute. And as I would understand it and interpret it, part of the thrust of getting these laws, the extradition, criminality, and the like, is partially directed towards enhancing the ability by the government in Beijing to address those sort of questions, that behavior, right, of individuals who are in an African context. So that's just an addendum to that. So to come to the questions that were asked, I think that absolutely China has taken very seriously the SDGs, and so it's made an effort to publish, to re-examine its own domestic development policies and point out where SDG alignment might be. Even if you look at the FOCAC itself, the documents, the agenda, there's reference to the to UN alignment on questions like the anti-corruption issue and the like. So aligning China-Africa policies such that, or they're drawing from the work at the United Nations. So this is all very much in tow. It's happening already. And I think the more you dig, the more you will see that kind of referencing and alignment. Peace and security represents probably the weaker end of it. I think there's more going to be found in what would be the development sector, but it's there certainly. On the question, the other question of whether the United States can learn from China or what it can learn from China. I mean, I think that quote I provided on by the Foreign Minister of Djibouti, I mean, says a lot to me, where he's the one speaking, not me. And he's saying, look, the cooperative efforts in security represent, you know, half of the equation, but we're developing countries. And we need resources. There's recognition amongst some of the officials in Washington that development finance has to be ratcheted up if that's indeed, you know, that would be if they want to win the attention of and gain support. But the overarching larger question underneath this is competition, is global competition in Africa the primary driver? I don't think it was until recently. I think that it was a case that they saw more points of convergence and cooperation. There may have been institutions that looked at things slightly differently, but, you know, even in areas of security such as counterterrorism, I think there was a shared agenda that's a few years back. Post 2018, post the declaration on the part of the United States of China as competitor, we've seen a kind of hardening of those tendencies already. We see Chinese responses as well. We see all the kind of things that historians would later point to as formative positions that culminate in a Cold War kind of scenario. It's still too early for that language. It's used too glibly, but still there is that competitive features are now there. What can it mean for Africa? I think that at some level, Africa welcomes, but I'll leave my colleagues, and especially Professor ALAO, to comment on this. But my sense is that Africa welcomes a variety of actors because they can cut a better deal, if you like. But there is a point where that kind of logic doesn't, where the logic of, to quote that old proverb, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled type of thing. So there's a point where that logic of competitive advantage thing doesn't really work to Africa's advantage. But I'll stop there and ask.
Thank you, Chris. If I can take maybe 3 more questions directed at the keynote speaker, and if Chris, if you can try to deal with these briefly, then we can have an opportunity to hear again from Professors ALAO and Jung. One of our research fellows, who you will hear from later in the week, Fanhui Che, asks, do you think China's gradualist and cautious approach to its involvement in African security will remain so in the near future? Or can we expect China to become more, quote unquote, intrusive with large military deployments to Africa? In what country, which African countries, if any, might China break away from this current cautious approach? From Professor Jamie Munson, we have a question about the extradition and legal framework and illegal activities in Africa. Is the momentum for this coming from African leaders and publics, or from the Chinese side? And then finally, a question from Justin Daniels. Does China-Africa security cooperation impact democracy and autocracy on the African continent? Does China favor working with autocratic states? Similarly, to what extent does the law enforcement cooperation you highlighted introduce Chinese legal norms to African democratic societies? So if we could try to take those.
Thank you. First, on the gradualist approach, I think that will remain. It's the norm dealing with it. Part of the reason I made that comment about let's look at interests in BRI countries, with the 6 economic corridors and the like, is to say that the kind of, if one interprets China's security concerns partially driven, if not significantly driven, by its economic interests are more exposed in other places. They're there in Africa in all the ways I've said. But I think where possible, gradualism and multilateralism will certainly prevail. If things were to change, I think it would, where would China be most likely to be seen to be intervening in a big way? I think it would have to be a place where its citizens and its interests were most exposed. So the countries that have that highest level exposure, if there was a crisis of some kind, it would require a response. That's what, when there's a crisis in a country, an African country or any other country, the expectation of the nationals is that there will be some rescue operation or some kind of thing like that. So that's where I would expect a change if such a thing was to happen. It may not happen. Jamie's question about the momentum, where the push, was this a push or a following along thing or what have you? I guess it's an interpretive point, right? But when I read the FOCAC documents, it reads very strongly as a concern. I read it as a concern driven by Beijing. I think that's where I see most of it, but it may be, without a doubt, there's shared compliance on this. Both parties want this to happen for the reasons I just said earlier. If there's a bad apple operating in a sector in a given country, it's African citizens and African economies that get thrown out of whack by that. So it certainly would suit African governments to be able to facilitate the Chinese action to help, collective action to get the criminal and get them out. So I suppose that would be what I would say. But I do think that there is some, my reading is it's the momentum's from China, partly because it's been much more active in this sector when it comes to people who were born in China but are living overseas with other passports and those sorts of concerns. The anti-corruption drive, that's been one of the great dilemmas, is senior figures who corrupted figures will live overseas and enjoy protection in that respect. So I think it's trying to address and amend those kind of problems. And the third question, I cannot remember, I don't see the thing on my screen.
It was about whether or not China-Africa security cooperation impacts democracy and autocracy in African countries, and whether China favors working with autocratic states.
I don't know now whether I would answer it the way I would answer in the past, but certainly in the past I would say that there's no distinction, it was working with every government of any kind. I think it favored efficiency. Efficiency is not, I don't know where this idea that autocratic governments are more efficient than democratic governments comes from. I mean, when all the decision-making is stuck in the hands of one individual, I can't think of a worse kind of arrangement, setting aside any additional unpleasantness that comes with that. So it's not clear to me, but the relationships that have deepened over time have the drive on the African side to seek out China and to strengthen those relationships if they're under pressure from Western sources. And the responsiveness of China has been largely positive, not always though. They've sort of kept them at arm's length at times, right? That depends on the Zimbabwe's, absolutely Sudan and Khartoum at certain points. So I would hate to give a universal answer to that. I think it's regime specific. It's the politics of the day. So it will look that way in some cases. In other cases, they'll have quite frosty relationships, whether they're autocratic or democratic.
Great. Thank you so much. And now I have a few questions for the entire panel. James Mayers asks, I can see how lawfare has played a role in enabling big Chinese investments in Africa. How has it been deployed to advance the diverse interests of the myriad small and medium Chinese enterprises in Africa. We have a question from Alicia Hoffman regarding human trafficking. A major security question that Africa has been dealing with is that of human trafficking. What role has China played working with the AU and national governments in mitigating human trafficking, especially in the BRI countries on the continent? Human trafficking does have a bearing on the security development nexus. From April Herlevy, who is also going to be speaking, or who spoke the other day, could all of the participants discuss how they think the concept of non-interference is evolving? For Professors ALDEN and Jung, given the FOCAC action plan, it seems that China's non-interference must change. How will it evolve? For Professor ALAO, what are the African perspectives on this concept? Do African citizens expect Chinese interference in domestic politics? Do they welcome it, or would they like to prevent it? And maybe if I can add one more, how does increasing multipolarity inform Chinese and US security interests in Africa? As mentioned, there were new and old security partners to Africa. What opportunities and challenges does this multipolarity pose to Africa and to China? Let's take that round, and it looks like we might have time, so I can try to squeeze in a few more after this. And if we can take them maybe in backward order, so Professor Jung and Professor ALAO, and then Chris last.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Okay, first of all, I want to add something to some questions earlier about the first question, whether China aligned the African peace, security, and the UN SDGs. I think that as Professor Chris mentioned, China pays lots of importance on this. Actually, there is, I just give you an example. In 2016, actually after the pass of the UN SDGs in 2015, I mean the next year, then China and the UN, we jointly created a fund named UN Peace and Development Fund. China donated $100 million for this fund. This fund will last for 10 years. That it means from 2016 to 2025. But several days ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he delivered his speech at the 55th anniversary of the UN establishment, he promised that to last 5 years more for this fund. That means this fund will be last for 2030. This fund now has operated for 4 years. We have donated $100 million to it, and there are two sub-funds. One is for UN SDGs, another is for peace and security. Two sub-funds altogether have invested in more than 80 projects in developing countries. A large part went to Africa. So this is the first question as to the SDG and the African peace and security. The second, as to the legal cooperation, James, I think, yeah, this cooperation for me my understanding is that because law, we mainly focus on supporting Africa's development. So these security affairs, much of them actually related to development, legal cooperation. Actually, the main goals maybe include, first of all, to promote Africans' legal and governance. Then the second is to strengthen the protection of Chinese overseas interest in Africa. And maybe the third is to pave the way for upgrading China-Africa bilateral investment protection, because most of the bilateral investment protection treaties will signed maybe 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Actually, that means it's out of function. So we have to update, upgrade these treaties. So if we want to upgrade these treaties, we have to have the legal basis for this. This is the legal cooperation. As to the human, I think I don't know the details about the human traffic or something like this, but from a much broader perspective, if the economic development situation be improved, then there's such human traffic or other things, I think that maybe will be better. Then as to the non-interference, I don't think that China will change this non-interference, but yes, with the context changed, there must be some, adjustment. For example, in 1970s, 1980s, Chinese non-interference, not this principle, but those detailed policies or those detailed policies. That time we didn't interfere into the target's domestic affairs. This is one side. Another side, we also didn't interfere the policy of other countries, the third country, to intervene the target country. For example, we didn't intervene US policy to intervene, for example, Sudan or Zimbabwe's domestic affair. But for now, I think that the main change is we see non-interference. We still keep not to intervene into, for example, Sudan's domestic affair, but we now try to intervene or stop Americans' policy to intervene Sudan's domestic affair. I can see in the past, it's a passive way to adhere to non-interference principle, but now it's much more active. This is some difference between, the past and the current approach. But that doesn't mean China will change totally the non-interference principle, because that's a very important foreign policy principle for us and for the developing countries. And finally, multipolar. I think that Professor Chris ALDEN is right. maybe there are many how to say impacts on Africa, on China, but I think that the key is for Africa to have more choice, to have more opportunities. But sometimes maybe it turns to a bargaining chips for Africa or even for China. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jung. If we can turn to Professor ALAO, in addition to some of the questions that were asked generally to all of the panelists, I had one additional question that I wanted to add for you from Margaret Frist. And she asked whether or not China's increasing technological partnership, in particular in artificial intelligence infrastructure, such as facial recognition in countries like Zimbabwe, with African countries concern you? What are the greater geopolitical security implications of these partnerships in your opinion? And perhaps just as a quick reminder, I think several of the other questions wanted to get a sense of perceptions, African perceptions about some of the differences between US and China's security approach, yes, along those lines. So if you could be brief, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether I'll be able to address all, but I will try as much as possible to address some of this. The first one I want to comment on, I think there was a question as to who is responsible for the momentum, especially the illegal aspect of the relationship, what I consider to be the momentum for illegality in terms of relationship between China and Africa. In my own opinion, I think it's a tactical alliance of the dishonest. I think that's the best way I can describe it. The tactical alliance of the dishonest. It's a case of where dishonest Africans try as much as possible to look for dishonest Chinese to collaborate. And the other way around to dishonest Chinese looking for dishonest Africans to collaborate. So, but whichever way, it's just a case of one side seeking out the other, and then the continent suffers for it. It's often said that when two elephants fight, the grass suffer. But the truth also is that when two elephants make love, the grass suffer. Africa is the grass here, a victim of both fighting and love making. So in terms of who is responsible for the momentum, I think it's just is what I call the tactical alliance of the dishonest. Dishonest side in one side, seeking out dishonest partner in the other. I completely agree with Professor Holding when he addressed the question of whether China would prefer democratic or autocratic states. I think I completely agree with that. It is not the system of government that is important to China. It is the consistency of interest. So China is willing to align with everything that advances its interests. So I think I completely agree with Chris on that. On the human trafficking, it is not something that features very prominently on China's agenda, except for the country to support initiatives, individual initiatives of African countries and that of continental organizations, whether ECOWAS, SADC, or the African Union. So it is not something that that China really, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think it's something that features very prominently on China's agenda. Now, the crucial one on the issue of non-interference. Let me make it clear that as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing like non-interference. What we have instead is what one may consider to be strategic interference. It is not possible for, it will be difficult for anyone to convince me that China has a non-interference policy in Africa. No. The country gets involved where it is strategically important for it to get involved. Where its interest is, where its core interest is affected, the Chinese government has a way of reaching out to other African governments or whichever side is involved in anything of interest. So it is strategic interference, not a case of non-interference. On the technology and the artificial intelligence aspect of it, let me say that it is not something that I've looked at very closely, and it's something that I will try and look at, and maybe I'll be in a position to discuss more intelligently on this. I think I've very briefly touched on the key issues, but if there's anyone that inadvertently escaped my attention, I'll be willing to address such later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lau. And Chris, if you could wrap up, try to pick up on a few of the comments and questions.
Sure. I think the first question about is lawfare deployed for small medium enterprises advanced. I think insofar as Professor Chun said, that you know, removing the regulatory barriers to investment, the kind of systematizing that, those are good for small and medium enterprises. So I think that developmental impact is a fairly straightforward one. But in a way, just to link that up to the next question, we talk about human trafficking. If you look at some of the joint security policing operations that have happened with African governments and China, some of the common features of criminal activities have been, in fact, human trafficking. And so this is one of the areas that the expansion of a kind of shared joint operations, joint understanding of law will presumably enhance and I don't know, stamp out is probably too naive, but would at least curb some of this conduct. The non-interference principles, my colleagues have said most anything I would have said on this topic. I think just it's not a surprise. Governments have principles that they enunciate, and their activities sometimes are distant from what they say are their principles. So I don't think that's any, I wouldn't expect to see much change in the principle. The actions are what I would be interested in ultimately. Multipolarity does pose a challenge for the reasons, again, my colleagues have put forward. I think that it's the challenge that possibly may be the one that China is less attuned to. Multipolarity of emerging powers in the continent. I think that's something somewhat different from what it's been engaging in up to this point and how it's viewed the continent. So it'll be interesting to see how managing where China is seen to be the dominant power and the others are seen to be sort of chipping away at the edges, the arguments and positions that China has acquired in African economies and political life. That's it from me.
On behalf of our director, Professor Deborah Browdigam, and the rest of us at SAIS CARI, we want to thank the speakers, particularly our keynote, Chris ALDEN, for preparing a really thorough and an interesting presentation today. We want to thank the audience for sticking with us. I know we've gone a few minutes over, and we really appreciate your tuning in. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Carnegie Foundation for their support of our research fellows and these events that we've been able to host. Thank you particularly to Marie Foster, who again has been dealing with the nuts and bolts of this and this whole series. And without her and our amazing colleagues in IT at SAIS, we wouldn't be able to do this. We do have 5 more events coming up tomorrow again, and again next week, Tuesday through Friday. Tomorrow's topic is emerging technology and security implications. So that question about satellites, spatial imaging, and those will be addressed in some detail in a number of papers that will be presented tomorrow. And we hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.